When you look at this airplane, you think it belongs in Star Wars. But this plane is real and it's not new. SR-71 Blackbird. This was born in 1964. After World War II, when the Allies defeated the Nazis and the Japanese, the next day there was a new enemy in front of them. The Soviet Union, and the Cold War just started. In the 1950s, to spy on the Soviets, the US used the Lockheed U-2. Even though this airplane didn't have a high speed, but it could fly in higher altitudes, and that was in a way where it couldn't be seen or any missiles could catch it. When the Soviets were taking nuclear weapons to Cuba, it was the U-2s that found out. In those altitudes, they could easily spy on the Russians. But the Soviets didn't sit back. They created a missile called the SA-2 that could catch this thing. In the year 1960, one of these missiles actually shot down a U-2, and the American pilot was caught by the Russians. Before the Russians shot this thing down, the US knew it had to be replaced, and that's why, since the year 1957, they were working on a new design for an aircraft. They were designing a plane that couldn't be seen and no missile could catch. Back in the day, Lockheed Martin wasn't grouped up with Martin Marietta, and that's why it was only considered Lockheed. Lockheed first designed an airplane called the Lockheed A-12. In the year 1962, the American Air Force tested this aircraft in Area 51. After the test passed, Lockheed built 15 of these bad boys. This plane was used in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and it was also used to spy on the Soviets. But it was a plane that caused a lot of accidents because in a short time, 6 of these 15 aircrafts were crashed. When information came to Lockheed that these things are crashing left and right, they decided to build something better. They were successful because in 2 years, they got rid of the A-12 and retired it, and SR-71 Blackbird was born. In our video about titanium, we said this airplane used a lot of titanium. Let's see how much was used. 92% of this airplane is made from titanium. This is the fastest aircraft in the world. Its speed catches to Mach 3.3, and that's more than 3,600 kilometers an hour. This is in a way where the F-22, which is the best fighter jet in history, goes about 2,400 kilometers an hour. This wasn't the maximum speed the SR-71 could go. It could go way higher. But Lockheed suggested you cannot go faster than that because it gets dangerous. In 1986, the SR-71 was sent to spy. During this operation, a missile was shot towards the SR-71, but since the pilot didn't want to get hit, let's say he put the pedal to the metal. And the aircraft reached Mach 3.5, and that's more than 4,300 kilometers an hour. There's a lot of airplanes that could go Mach 3, but they can't do that for a very long time. If they continue to go that speed, it could get dangerous and destroy the frame. But the SR-71 could go Mach 3 for 90 minutes straight. As you know, the flight between New York and London is about 6 hours, but this aircraft could go that distance in 1 hour and 54 minutes. And that meant it could outrun pretty much every missile in that era, and nobody's gonna catch it. You could say this is a missile, but it has 2 wings. Some people might say that the X-15 is the fastest airplane. X-15 is faster than the SR-71, but the X-15 is not considered an airplane. It is a rocket aircraft, and it cannot take off by itself like an airplane. The X-15 has its own story and deserves its own video. But it wasn't just the high speed. The advanced radar system and jammers would make this thing invisible. But one of the things that held it back was the heat of the exhaust, and it was so hot that it could be seen in the radars. But that didn't matter to the SR-71 because this machine still has another unbroken record, and that means the SR-71 could go 85,000 feet in the air. Even though this aircraft was ready in 1964, but it took 4 years of testing, then it entered service. Because you could say in the 4 years, they were torture testing it. SR-71 was mostly used as a spy plane. It started its job in the Vietnam War, and it continued all the way to the end of the Cold War. It's good to know that in the Vietnam War, 800 missiles were shot at the SR-71, but not a single one was hit. Obviously, this aircraft was never sold to any country, and only 32 were made, and they worked for over 30 years. In its 30-year lifespan, nobody could shoot this thing down, but unfortunately, it brought itself down, and 11 of these SR-71s were crashed. Even though it was a very useful aircraft, but it was expensive to operate. When one of these flew, it meant it's costing $100,000 an hour. You might not believe it, but after each flight, a lot of parts had to be swapped to fly again. Another cool thing about this aircraft is that it used so much fuel to take off that it needed a refuel when it got into the air, and that was to continue the mission. All this is a part of the cost. When we get to the 90s, this extremely advanced aircraft had to get retired because military drones that were a lot cheaper and more advanced were starting to embarrass it. NASA also used 2 of these aircrafts, and that was mostly for test pilots. As you know, a lot of astronauts in NASA used to be test pilots before they came into the astronaut department, and an astronaut should be able to handle an aircraft like this. NASA retired their 2 aircrafts 1 year after the Air Force. A lot of people thought after the SR-71, the SR-72 and the SR-73 were gonna be made, but they closed the door and they said nothing else is coming. The thing that's coming are drones. You could say drones are eliminating all the other aircrafts because they're useful in every other way. After this, the most powerful air forces had to have a good drone technology. The operations that the SR-71 performed were all at war, and war is not a good thing. But the engineering and building this aircraft is extremely interesting to talk about. In the year 1960s, Lockheed got $34 million each for the SR-71. That's an absurd number. That equals $340 million in today's money. And that's in a way where the Phantom F4, which was the latest fighter aircraft in that era, only cost $2.4 million. So the SR-71 is more than 15 times the cost of the F4. Right now, there's 20 SR-71. You might think they sent it to the graveyard in Tucson, Arizona, which we made a video about. But this aircraft is a little too special to go to a graveyard. All the SR-71s that survived, plus the A-12s, are found in museums across America, and anybody can go and see them. It's around the 1960s, and the US believes that their fighters aren't good enough anymore against the Soviets. And that is why they were trying to design a fighter that could be used in the Vietnam War. The Department of Defense was also looking for a jet that could be used on aircraft carriers. This decision gave birth to the F-111. You could say they were disappointed in this plane because the performance was not good enough, especially for the Navy. They got the F-111 and started using it, but they were still looking for something better. The Department of Defense spoke with different companies to create the best fighter they can. A race started between the companies, and in the end, the concept by Grumman won. Grumman is now part of Northrop Grumman, but back in the day, it was just Grumman. One of the main reasons Grumman's design won is because of the wing design and technology, and that allowed it to hit insane speeds. And back then, Pratt & Whitney designed the engine for it, called the TF-30. The fighter you're seeing here had the most advanced radar system for its time, and it could even track Soviet missiles. The system you're seeing is an anti-missile system called the flare. You could say the flare confuses the missile, and instead of making contact with the jet, it hits these flares. And you could say this is one of the most important things that this fighter had. And when the design was finished, they named it F-14 Tomcat. Two AIM-54 Phoenix missiles are on this plane, and it has an M61 Vulcan machine gun, the same gun that's used on the F-22. Just imagine for its time what kind of a monster this was. This fighter could go as high as 51,000 feet, and that was done on purpose. It's good to know that 51,000 feet is about 15.5 kilometers. But why did it go this high? Because the Russian bombers would cruise a little bit lower than this, and they designed the F-14 to cruise above these bombers. The more we talk about this fighter for its time, we can't say enough. This fighter jet has a speed of 2,485 kilometers an hour. The F-14 was ready in the year 1974, a time where the Vietnam War was pretty much done, and this fighter was never used for that war. The first test that this fighter passed was in the Iran-Iraq War. When the US designed the F-14, they decided to not sell it to any other country and keep it for themselves. But Iran and the US had good connections, and the USSR was right above them, and they were threatening, and that caused the US to accept $2 billion for 80 F-14s. The F-14s that were given to Iran basically showed its ability to the world. These F-14s, plus the trained pilots, really destroyed the Iraqi Air Force. The Russians had the most modern Russian jets, like the MiG-23 or the Su-22, but when the F-14s were in the air, they would not be found. If you search who's the most successful F-14 pilot on Google, it'll say Jalil Zandi. This Iranian pilot with his F-14 killed 11 Iraqi aircrafts. Jalil was an F-14 pilot for all of the war. Near the end of the world, France gave Saddam the Mirage F-1, but the Mirage was not good enough either, and they couldn't keep up with the Iranian F-14s. The Director of National Intelligence reports in the Iran-Iraq War, just the F-14s alone destroyed 160 Iraqi aircraft. 58 MiG-23s, 33 Mirage F-1s, 23 MiG-21s, 23 Su-20s and 22s, 9 MiG-25s, 5 Tu-22s, 2 MiG-27s, and a few other planes. So the F-14 passed the most important test in the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam's army would lie and say they destroyed 70 Iranian F-14. But Director of National Intelligence says, compared to 160 Iraqi jets, only 16 F-14s were lost in the war. If you know anything about dogfights, is that destroying 11 aircrafts is an insane number, especially by one pilot. And that is why it's impressive that Jalil Zandi is the best pilot for the F-14. Jalil was part of the Iranian Air Force until the year 2001. And even though in the entire Iran and Iraq war, he stayed safe and was able to kill 11 aircrafts, this time in a car crash in Tehran, he and his wife lost their lives. There's a lot of different fighters made all around the world, but no fighter like the F-14 actually got to experience this much combat in such a long war. And that is why the F-14 Tomcat is known as one of the most successful fighter jets. Iran and the US are the only countries that have this fighter. Until the year 2006, the US Navy would use the F-14 on their carriers. But after 2006, they decided to retire it because of maintenance costs. But 24 F-14s are still active in the Iranian Air Force. So what did the US military replace the F-14 with? The F-18 Super Hornet. You might not believe it, but the F-18 is not better than the F-14. It's cheaper, it's slower, but it's a little newer. You could kind of compare the F-18 and the F-14 like this. F-14 is like the F-22, the F-18 is the F-35. If you wanted to buy an F-14 in 1975, you would have to pay $38 million. You might ask, why did Iran buy 80 of them for $2 billion? I don't know, maybe they got a discount. Even though the F-18 came into market in 1984, it's like a normal fighter, and they still build them to this day, and they sell them to other countries. The price is about $30 million each as well. It's good to know that a normal person can buy a fighter jet. In terms of the US law, if a fighter jet has been retired and every weapon has been taken off, you could sell that aircraft. Not to go fight other planes, but to just enjoy it. But we have to say, you can't buy an F-14 because only the US and Iran has this plane. And since the US doesn't want Iran to have any of the parts of this plane, they won't sell it to anyone. The US has always tried to make the best fighters they can. Their goal in the Cold War was to always be ahead of the Soviet Union and always be in control in the air. They created a lot of fighters, but one of them is the best one, and that's the F-22 Raptor. This plane is a lot older than the F-35, the plane that a lot of people think is the most advanced. But that's not the case. F-22 is a fighter that the US doesn't sell to any other countries. Even the closest allies they won't sell to. In 1985, the Pentagon requests something, and they say we need a fighter that can't be detected in radars. They had fighters that would not be detected, but they wanted the best one they could possibly have. In 1986, the US chose two companies. One of them was Lockheed Martin, and the other one was Northrop. And they asked them to create a fighter to replace the F-15 and be way better. These two started working, and 4 years later, Lockheed Martin showed us the YF-22. And Northrop showed us the YF-23. And the Pentagon said, after running some tests, we're gonna choose one of these. And that's when YF-22 beats the Northrop YF-23. And the thing was, it was better at not being detected, and it was quicker. From the day the Pentagon gave the orders to the day they received it, it took 12 years. And the first YF-22 that was given to the Army was in the year 1997. This plane is extremely quick, and that is why when it gets up to speed, the body gets very hot. To fix that, 39% of the body is made from titanium. 24% is different forms of composite. And 15% of it is made from aluminum. Another thing Lockheed Martin did to this plane is that they laid an epoxy that they don't say what it is, and it's top secret. And they believe if that epoxy does not exist, when this plane gets up to speed, it will burn up. So what engines does this thing have? The engines are made from Pratt & Whitney. Two F-119 PW100s are on this plane. Pratt & Whitney says these two engines create 70,000 pounds of thrust, and it's good to know that the F-35 has 43,000 pounds of thrust. That is insane. It has near double the power of the F-35. The maximum speed of this beast is 2,414 kilometers an hour, and it could go as high as 65,000 feet. These two things cause this plane to be unstoppable in the air, and it's made in a way that nobody's gonna catch up. It's one of the fastest planes while turning, and it could go as high as 65,000 feet. The F-22 has a lot of unique features. Another thing is a flap that's in front of the engines that flaps up and down, and it allows the plane to turn extremely quickly. And you could say it handles like a Formula One car. The things that other fighters can't do, the F-22 can. Even though the engines are extremely powerful and thirsty, but with the one tank of fuel, it goes 2,900 kilometers, and that's very interesting. It could go far distances without needing a refuel. Without refueling, it could go from London to Moscow. The way the radars are connected to the F-22 allows it to see everywhere, and you could say it watches out for 400 kilometers around itself. Even though the F-22 is an extremely advanced fighter, the pilot has to be ready for it, because the maneuvers this plane can do is a lot different from other fighters, and if the pilot of the plane is not ready for it, it could be dangerous. Every fighter jet has an ejection seat. It's on an F-22 as well. But the way this one works is a lot more intense. As you know, the ejection seat has rockets underneath it, and when it gets deployed, it shoots a rocket, and that allows it to not hit the plane itself. But the F-22 rocket has to be a lot more stronger because it moves at a faster speed. The F-22 can carry a lot. It could carry 3 missiles, and it also has a 20mm M61A2 Vulcan. It's an air-cooled machine gun, and it shoots 6,000 rounds a minute. This thing can carry 6 AIM-120 missiles and 8 AIM-9Xs. AIM-120 is an air-to-ground missile, and AIM-9 is an air-to-air missile. You could also carry bombs instead of the missiles on this F-22, like 2 1,000-pound JDAM, or 8 250-pound GBU-39s. As you know, these bombs are extremely advanced, and the pilot or the control room can control them, and it's a system that works with the world's GPS. In an emergency, the F-22 can be a cargo plane and carry 2.5 tons of weight, and it could dump it out with a parachute. With all this performance this plane has, is because money was spent on it. The US government has paid $150 million for each F-22 Raptor, and that's in a way that the F-35, which is way newer, costs less than $100 million. And another thing about the plane is that Lockheed Martin is responsible for maintaining the vehicle, and until the day they retire, they're responsible to keep it safe. And for this responsibility, each plane is gonna cost $334 million, and the US government has to pay Lockheed Martin for that. But that's not it. Each hour this thing flies, is $65,000, and that includes the workers, the fuel, and other things. The US government has bought 195 F-22 Raptors, and they have paid more than $67 billion for these things. At first, they wanted to sell these planes to other countries, but in 1997, Congress decided to never sell the F-22 to any foreign nation. You know what the reason for that is? It's that it's too good at not showing up on the radar. This technology allows the F-22 to show up 40,000 times smaller, so an F-22 will be the size of a mosquito. And this means that it will not show up on the radar. This is a very deadly plane as well. The F-22 successfully shot down 108 other fighters without getting damaged, and that is why they also call it the deadliest plane in the world. After 2011, the US stopped ordering F-22s, and it's just 195 in their arsenal. A lot of people believe they're creating more of these, and they're probably gonna show it soon. When we uploaded the video about the F-22 Raptor, a lot of you asked, is the Su-57 better or the F-22? And a lot of you asked to compare them. This video is going to be a comparison between these two fighters, and whatever we say is out of the mouth of experts in the aerospace industry. First of all, we have to say that you really can't compare these two together because they're never next to each other, and not one country can have both planes in their arsenal. And like you know, the US and Russia are huge competitors in this industry, and most of the things are classified. Both the Su-57 and the F-22 Raptor are made for the same type of mission. Just like we said in the F-22 video, this is a really fast fighter jet with amazing performance. But a lot of experts say the Su-57 is better, especially in maneuverability. The main reason the F-22 was built was because of how stealthy it is. And you could say Lockheed Martin tried their best to make the stealthiest fighter jet ever made. Every centimeter of the F-22 is built to escape the enemy's radar. The paint used on the plane is something special as well. It's a classified type of epoxy that in high speeds, it doesn't let the metal burn, and the epoxy makes it more invisible. This 19-meter fighter jet is seen like a mosquito in the radar, and you could say it's probably not going to be seen. But the Su-57 is not completely stealthy. It's only the front end. When it's seen in the radar, it's a weird shape, and it's called the Pac-Man shape, an old video game that most of you know about. The front end can't be seen, but the rest of it can. The Su-57 is designed in a way that if it comes behind another plane, it cannot be seen because the front end is completely hidden in the radars. But from the side or the rear, it can be seen. In the stealthy department, the F-22 is the winner. But let's go to the next one. Maneuverability. The F-22 Raptor is the most maneuverable fighter jet the US has ever made, and this is with the help of the flaps that are in front of the Pratt & Whitney engines. But even though this is the most maneuverable American jet, the Su-57 is more maneuverable. The jets of the Su-57 don't have any flaps like the F-22, but the engines have this 3D motion that could be turned to whichever direction it needs. You could say this design has made the Su-57 the most maneuverable fighter jet in the world. You could say it's equal right now. The F-22 is more stealthy. The Su-57 is more maneuverable. But let's go talk about the performance of the two planes. Pratt & Whitney supplies the engines for the F-22, and just like we said before, both of them create 70,000 pounds of thrust. The maximum speed is 2,414 kilometers an hour, and without refueling, it could fly 2,900 kilometers. And also, the plane could go as high as 65,000 feet. The Su-57 has a more powerful engine, and it creates 79,400 pounds of thrust. But the maximum speed is lower. Just like we said, the F-22 can go 2,414 kilometers an hour, but the Su-57 has a maximum speed of 2,130 kilometers an hour. So if they chase each other, the F-22 is gonna escape. But don't underestimate the Su-57. It could go 1,000 feet higher than the F-22, so it can reach 66,000 feet. In performance, you could say they're kind of equal. F-22 is faster, this could go higher. So you could say their performance is pretty equal. But let's go look at the radar system. If you want to count radius-wise, the F-22 can see farther, and what we're trying to say is that if they're next to each other, the F-22 is gonna see the Su-57 quicker. And one of the main reasons is their exhaust. The way the F-22 exhaust is designed, it's more stealthy. But just like we said, the Su-57 is hidden from the front, but the rear can be seen in the radar. So in this department, the Su-57 can't win, because when the enemy sees you first, you kinda lost at that point. They could launch missiles, or they could easily escape if they need to, and the F-22 is way faster, so it could escape. So in the radar department, the F-22 won. But let's look at their firepower. The F-22 has 3 weapon compartments. Like we said in our video, the F-22 can carry air-to-air missile and air-to-ground missile, and it could also carry different types of bomb. And on the right wing of the F-22, there's the M61 Vulcan, and it's an insane air-cooled 6,000 rounds per minute machine gun, and that's 100 rounds a second. That's insane. Take a listen. This is an air-cooled machine gun, so if it's being used on the ground, they can't just rapid fire because it's gonna overheat. But on the F-22, it could shoot for longer before it overheats. But let's look at the Su-57's firepower. This fighter has 2 compartments for weapons. And in the 2 spots, it could carry 4 different missiles. The Russians use the K-77 missiles inside this jet. Missiles that have a range of 193 kilometers. The F-22 has AIM-120 missiles that has a 180 kilometer range. In the firepower department, they're pretty equal. The F-22 can carry more, but the Su-57 has more range. The experts in the aerospace industry believe that if these two were able to fight, the F-22 will more likely win. What do you guys think? Which one of these is the better fighter? Please comment. You've most likely heard about the B-2 stealth bomber. And you might have seen our video about the HO-229. But all these planes are in the past because a new kid is in town. The B-21 Raider. Just like its father, this thing is also a stealth bomber. The same company that built a B-2 bomber, meaning Northrop Grumman, built the B-21. This thing flies at about 50,000 feet, and that's about 15,240 meters. This height is exactly the same as the B-2, but experts believe that the B-21 can fly way higher, and it could go as high as 70,000 feet. Even though B-21 is newer, it's smaller and it carries less weight. It can carry about 13.5 tons worth of bombs. But the B-2 can carry up to 20 tons. At first, Northrop Grumman wanted to make this a drone, and that means it wouldn't have a pilot. But when they realized that this thing is going to be carrying an atomic bomb, they decided not to go with the drone idea. And someone should be on board if they decide to drop an atomic bomb. The B-2 has a special paint that's black, and it makes it stealthy, but the B-21 is painted white. They didn't say the reason they chose white paint, but it's for sure more stealthy than the B-2. And you could find similar technology on the F-22 and F-35. The B-2 is not completely digital, and it has analog parts, but the B-21 is completely digital, and this allows the engineers to always have this thing upgraded when they need it to. And you could treat it like a computer update rather than a part upgrade. When they revealed the B-21, they never showed the rear of it, and they never said how many engines it has. The front is obvious, it has 2 air ducts, but you can't see the rear, and you don't know if it has 4 jet engines or 2 jet engines, or maybe something exotic. And obviously everything is classified. Since this aircraft is so classified, why did they even reveal it in the first place? The main reason is the deal that the United States has with Russia, and that deal says if you built a new bomber and want to actually use it around the world, you have to reveal it to the world. So that is the exact reason the B-21 was revealed. It's good to know that the B-2 stealth bomber is extremely expensive, and it costs about $2 billion each. So how much is the B-21? It's a little bit cheaper, and one of the main reasons is that it's smaller. It carries less weight. But one of the main reasons it's cheaper is because of the technology and the research and development that Northrop Grumman has. Each of these B-21 Raiders will cost about $692 million. So you could say it's pretty cheap compared to the B-2. It's about 1/3 of the price. The US Air Force has ordered 100 of these B-21, but no other information came out that when the plane will be exactly ready and when it's gonna take its first flight. In the year 2009, when Obama was president, the government was starting to worry about the bomber fleets they had in stock, and they believed that they didn't have any modern bombers. At that time, the B-52 was over 50 years old, and the B-1 bomber was more than 35 years old, and the B-2 was about 20 years old, and that is why they needed a new bomber. In the year 1989, when they revealed the B-2 stealth bomber, the US military ordered 132 of them, and the plan was to replace the B-52 and the B-1 bomber, but the B-2 turned out to be so expensive, and the cost of flight is so high that after 21 of these were turned into the US military, they decided to cancel the rest of them. And that means 111 of these were canceled. And also, the B-52 and the B-1 are still flying. And that's exactly why they needed a new B-2 bomber. They needed something more modern, a little cheaper, and something that allows them to retire the older ones. Just like we said, at first, they wanted to make it a drone. But since it was carrying a nuclear weapon, they couldn't do that. In the year 2012, Obama signed a bill that gives a budget of $3.7 billion to build a new bomber. At that time, a lot of people complained that why are you wasting so much money? We don't need another military aircraft. We have the F-22, the F-35 is coming along. B-2, B-1, B-52, they're all flying. They have no problems. And you want to pay more for another one? But at that time, China revealed their new bomber, and after they revealed their new stealth bomber, a lot of these people kept their mouth shut after that. After the budget was signed, just like every time, they contacted 3 different companies and they told them what kind of an order they have in mind. And the order was a very modern aircraft that could replace the old ones. Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin were chosen. To do this, Boeing and Lockheed Martin partnered up to create a new bomber. But Northrop Grumman decided to go solo. This is the design that Boeing and Lockheed Martin came up, and it looks like a fighter jet craft rather than a traditional bomber we're used to. After Northrop Grumman built the B-2 bomber, they started to design a passenger aircraft that resembles the B-2 bomber, and the nickname was the Northrop Grumman 2025. The company was working on this project for a long time, but they never were ready to execute it. We already know that the government chose Northrop Grumman, and they built the B-21 Raider. But what made Northrop Grumman be chosen between the other two is that they had a lot of research in this style of aircraft. So they were very much ready to build another much more modern one. And also another reason Northrop Grumman was chosen was that the US government was kind of angry at the company Boeing, and the reason was that they had sold some tankers that had issues and they haven't figured out what the problem is. So Northrop Grumman was chosen, and they built something spectacular because they actually built something that's affordable for the US government. It's completely stealth, and because it's digital, you can upgrade it throughout the years. The B-21 was revealed, but it's not ready to use yet, and the plan is by the year 2026 or 2027, the B-21 enters service. So right now, we don't have a complete video of this thing actually flying around. First of all, they didn't even show the rear of it, and there is no footage of it flying yet. But experts believe that the era of bombers and fighter jets are over, and drones are taking it all. What do you guys think? When we look at the history of Germany in World War II, it's very surprising because in such a short period of time, they achieved a lot. Most of these findings was from doing evil activities like Joseph Mengele, but their industry was actually very advanced. Today, we want to look at one of these technologies, the Horten Ho 229, an insane idea of an aircraft. The radar could not detect it whatsoever. It was the fastest plane at its time, and it could go to the other side of the pond without refueling. The Germans were really trying their hardest to finish this early, and that's for only one thing: to attack New York City. The official name of this airplane was the Ho 229, but the nickname was the American Bomber, and what they meant was that this bomber is designed specifically for the United States. A plane like this was originally designed in the early 1930s, way before World War II was even an idea. Even though there was no war yet, but Hitler knew that the United States was one of the main enemies, and that is why they were always looking for tools to attack the Americans, and he always believed that they have to attack the US. In 1937, the Germans designed a plane called the Me-264, and they believed it could easily fly to the United States. In the year 1938, the commander of the Nazi Air Force by the name of Hermann Göring said, "We are designing weapons that could get to the other side of the pond, and that means the other side of the Atlantic Ocean." What he was trying to do was threat the US, but he never used the US name. This is in a way where World War II has not begun yet. Year after year passes and World War II has started, but Me-264, even though it could fly to the United States, but it couldn't carry anything with it, so it had to fly alone, and at that point, there was no reason to send it there. We get to the year 1944. The Russians are moving forward towards Germany, but the Germans believe even if the war is at a loss, we need to attack New York with this aircraft. The Nazi Air Force told its workers that we need an aircraft that could go 11,000 kilometers and it could carry 4,000 kilograms worth of bombs. They needed 11,000 kilometers so it would fly from Berlin all the way to America and back without refueling. But aircraft engineers in Germany would say a design like this is impossible. There has to be a stop for refueling, and they would choose the Azores Island in the middle of the Atlantic, and they said if they can refuel in this island, it's possible. In the middle of all this, there were two brothers that considered themselves aircraft engineers, and they're called the Horten brothers. They had a design that was meant for a bomber exactly like this, and with all their calculations, this bomber can do whatever the army needs. Just like we said, these two designed this aircraft from the 1930s, and at that time, it seemed unbelievable that such thing could be built because there was a plan to put 6 jet engines on there, and at this time, the most advanced planes had impellers. This design of an aircraft is called a flying wing, and what it means is that the entire aircraft is a wing and there's no actual body or tube. And because of this design, the Horten brothers believe that this plane will use 30% less fuel than an ordinary plane. And they believe the most important thing about this plane is that it will not be seen on the radars, and that's mostly because of the design. It's good to know that what the Horten brothers said about radars was one of the first times they mentioned this, because before then, there was no anti-radar aircraft. This was one of the final designs the Horten brothers drew. They first named it the Horten 18. The width was about 40 meters and the length was about 19 meters. And if you count the whole plane, it's about 150 square meters. Look at this plane. it doesn't seem like it belongs to the 40s. If someone saw this thing back in the day, they'll probably think it's a UFO. Even if you see this fly over your head, it's extremely insane. Imagine you saw it in 1944. The normal speed of the Ho 229 was about 750 kilometers an hour, but it had a top speed of 900 kilometers an hour, and that made it the fastest aircraft at that time. They never actually got to use this plane like that, but when the Horten brothers were building this plane, they said it could easily go to New York, bomb, and come back. There were 2 guns up front on this plane, and it also had a rear gun, and anyone that wanted to attack this plane, it had weapons to counterattack. Technology really leads to a design that doesn't make sense, and it's insane. And you might not believe it, the chassis of this aircraft was made from wood, and that was another reason why you could not see it on the radar. On February of 1945, this plane was pretty much finished, and they wanted to test it. There's only 2 months left until the war is over, but the Germans would not let this project go whatsoever, even though they were losing almost every battle on the Eastern-Western front. This plane was about to get done, and they still haven't tested yet. The Horten brothers were very good designers, but I wouldn't call them master engineers, and that is why aircraft engineers will always critique their work and always tell them that your design will never actually work in the real world. The engineers would say that if you want this thing to actually fly, you need to add a wing like this to it. The brothers would disagree and tell them that this brings the weight up and you can't do it anymore. But the brothers still went at it and tried to fix the issues. They said, we're gonna make the engines from 6 to 2 engine and make it a little bit smaller. They took the same aircraft and modified it and made it 2 jet engine. They say they tested this aircraft, but it was too late because the Allies were inside Berlin and the Germans decided to scrap the plane so nobody gets it. There are pictures of this aircraft flying, but we're not sure if it's real or not. It's good to know that the Horten brothers successfully changed this aircraft in under 2 months. They tested it, but they never used it. Because in April 1945, Berlin had fallen, and that's 2 months after they started to redesign the aircraft. All the designs and writings of this aircraft were in the Americans' hands now, and the US even has a piece of this aircraft, and they realized that the Germans had actually built 3 of these aircrafts, and 1 of these were destroyed. They don't know what happened with the other one, but 1 of them was in pieces and the Americans had it, and right now this piece is in a museum in Washington, D.C., and you could go and see it. When the Americans reviewed the design of this aircraft, they wouldn't believe it. These 2 brothers were considered geniuses at that time. There could have been fear in their eyes because they believed that if they did not defeat the Germans, this thing would attack New York. It's good to know that the Horten brothers designed the same style aircraft for a passenger one, but obviously something like this would never work because it would be too complicated and expensive. So what happened to these Horten brothers? One of them, called Raymar Horten, ran away to Argentina and they don't know much about him. But one of the brothers by the name of Walter Horten stayed in Germany and he basically started helping the West. This style of an aircraft came alive in the 1970s when the Americans were trying to design a bomber with the same design. The US started in 1970s and by the year 1989 they had done it and they built the B-2 stealth bomber, and this is one of the most expensive aircrafts in history. Walter Horten was alive until 1998 and he lived in West Germany. Even though he was part of the Nazi regime, He helped the Westerners, and that is why they pardoned him, and he eventually died in Germany. Even though the Nazis were not in power for a long time, but they brought a lot of technology in this world, and one of the most insane things they figured out was rocket and missile technology. A lot of people believe that if the US did not capture Nazi scientists, they could have not gone to the moon. But let's be honest, it would have taken a long time to figure out how rockets work. Forget about satellites and moon landing. In terms of medicine, the Nazis did a lot of experiments. As you know, the Axis powers were the Germans and the Japanese mainly, and they did a lot of experiments in terms of medicine at that time, but in extremely horrifying types of tests. If you've seen our video about Japan's Unit 731 or Joseph Mengele, Angel of Death, you should really check them out and see what type of experiments these people were running. When we uploaded the video about the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest plane in the world, we also spoke about the X-15, and we said it has a higher speed than the SR-71. But the X-15 doesn't count as an airplane, but it's a rocket that could carry a person. Today, we want to talk about the fastest flying object in the world. SR-71 is the fastest airplane, but the X-15 is the fastest thing that ever flew. X-15 is only meant as an experimental aircraft. So what kind of experiments are we talking about? An experiment that takes the pilot to the edge of space. The X-15 was used by NASA and the US Air Force as well. If you remember in our previous video, we said the SR-71 has a speed of 4,300 kilometers an hour, and that's exactly why it's known as the fastest airplane in history. So what's the speed of the X-15 then? On October 3rd, 1967, William J. Knight was flying an X-15 and he set a record of Mach 6.72. Do you know how fast Mach 6.72 is? If you turn it into kilometers, it's 7,273 kilometers an hour. After this took place, William J. Knight was known as the fastest man in the world. And even though it has been 55 years since that date, no other human has broken that record yet. When you look at the X-15, you realize that this is not an airplane. It's mostly a rocket that has two tiny wings, and it has a cabin for the pilot. You can't say it's a rocket or a missile or a plane because it has a piece of all that combined. Since the X-15 is not an airplane, it cannot lift off the ground, and that is why a B-52 has to take it up in the air while the pilot is inside it. And when they get where they want to be, they can release from the B-52. After this, the X-15 pilot begins work. Whenever they tested the X-15, they tried to take it as high as 100 kilometers, and you could basically say that's the edge of space. The highest point we have ever taken an aircraft in history was set by Joseph A. Walker. He took the X-15 as high as 107.8 kilometers, and you could count that as space. NASA says above 100 kilometers, it counts as space, and that is why any pilot that went past 100 kilometers, they would give them an astronaut badge. And even though they were not a part of NASA, they would still get that medal. And they would say, when you go past 100 kilometers, you're pretty much an astronaut, and a normal human cannot do what you just did. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, and a very famous astronaut. Before he was an astronaut, he was a test pilot, an X-15 test pilot to be exact. Just like we said, the X-15 was an experimental plane, and one of the experiments was to test out astronaut suits. The pilot would wear the suit, go around 100 kilometers up where there is no oxygen, and test out if the suit is working properly or not. But until we get here, the X-15 has evolved a lot. Because if you want to look at the history of this aircraft, in the beginning of the 1950s, a plane like this was built by Bell, called the Bell X-1. And it took the X-1 about 10 years to reach the X-15 level. And that's when we get to 1959, when the X-15 is officially tested. When they were designing an aircraft like this, a lot of aerospace engineers would critique it and say it would not work. They would believe when you release this thing, it will continue to spin and you can't control it. But the main designers knew what they were doing and they were not losing hope. In the end, in 1956, the design of the X-15 was ready, and the US government gives the design to North American Aviation and tells them to build 3 of these. Until this aircraft is ready and given to the US government, the Soviet Union had started the space race, and in 1957, the first satellite is sent to space, the Sputnik 1, and it's the first thing in history that was sent to space. When the US government realized what Soviets had done, they told the North American Aviation Inc. that you guys gotta change the design because we're taking this thing to space. But the X-15 engineers would disagree and say that would never work. The only way to make this thing work is to use a giant aircraft to send it up there. And it's good to know the only airplane that could do this was the B-52 bomber. The B-52 would go up about 180,000 feet and release the X-15. The insane speed of the X-15 would cause the aircraft to get extremely hot, especially the tip. The tip of this aircraft would reach the temperature of 670 degrees Celsius. And that is why, to build the body of this aircraft, just like the SR-71, titanium was used. And we've made a video on it. And since this was a rocket and it had a rocket engine, the exhaust system was made from titanium as well. And that's because a rocket causes a lot more heat than a jet engine. Just like we said, the first thing NASA wanted to test is astronaut suits in the X-15. The other experiment NASA wanted to do was that to test the capability of a man-made object, not in space. So they wanted to see how fast an aircraft can go inside the atmosphere. The only problem with the X-15 wasn't because it would get hot, it was the temperature differences. When this plane would burn up all the way to 670 degrees Celsius, and then when you slow it down and it gets cold once again, just this alone destroys the body panel. And that's why NASA believes that you can't get any hotter than that. At least titanium is not good enough for it. There might be an exotic material you can use that we haven't figured out yet, but to this day, nobody has surpassed the speed of the X-15 below the atmosphere. To run all the experiments they needed, in a span of 9 years, they flew the X-15 199 times. And the funny part is that each time the X-15 flew, the body panels were no good anymore, and it needed a lot of repairs. Even though it was made out of titanium, but the temperature differences would basically destroy the panels, and you couldn't fly it again until everything was fixed. Even though after each flight, the X-15 was tested and repaired, but unfortunately, one of these had a bad ending. On the 15th of November 1967, Michael J. Adams was experimenting with an X-15 and he was flying around 230,000 feet. Nobody knows what happens, but he loses control of the X-15 at that distance and he starts free falling. When this happens, the speed of the aircraft was Mach 5. We've said this before, but we'll say it again. Each Mach is the speed of sound, and when we say Mach 5, we mean 5 times the speed of sound, and that's 6,125 kilometers an hour. Either way, when the X-15 was free falling at this speed, the body could not handle it anymore, and the X-15 starts falling apart, and in a span of seconds, the body completely demolishes, and unfortunately, the pilot dies. After this incident, NASA did not want to use it anymore, but the Air Force used this for 11 more months, then officially retired it. Even though it has been years since something like this was used, and technology has advanced drastically, but NASA still believes that this is a maximum speed a human can go inside an aircraft under the atmosphere. Humans might figure something out that could go faster than that, but in the last 55 years, nothing has happened yet. When we talk about cars, we always say the final price at the end, but this is not a car. But before I let you go, let me tell you the price. North American Aviation asked about $9 million each for these aircraft, and if you want to count that in today's dollars, that's about $90 million. It seems like it's not that bad, because if you want to compare it to the SR-71 Blackbird, it's about a quarter of the price. But each time the X-15 flew, it costs a lot of money. Each flight with the X-15 costs $600,000, and that's about $6 million in today's money. We've made a lot of videos about different airplanes on this channel, new and old. But what we haven't talked about is when they die. These planes have a due date and they will eventually retire, so they have to go in the grave. If it doesn't go to the grave, it has to be a very special plane and it goes to the museum. And that's for a few of them. The rest of them go to the junkyard. Remember this name, 309 AMARC, and that stands for the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group. This is the biggest graveyard in the world, but that's an airplane graveyard. All the airplanes that come here are military aircraft. Passenger aircrafts have their own graveyard. These get parted out, but it's a lot more complicated for these than passenger aircrafts. We have to get to Tucson, Arizona to get to 309 AMARC. Right now, there is more than 4,000 aircrafts parked in this area. 800 people work here, and their job is to inspect these airplanes to figure out how to get rid of it. Should they rebuild it? Should they part it out or sell the parts? Even though these airplanes are practically dead, but the value of all these is about $35 billion. Let's look at the history of AMARC. This graveyard started after World War II, and that's because in World War II, the US had a lot of junk aircrafts and they had to get rid of it. And that was the reason they took over a giant piece of land so they can park these aircrafts. That's why they went to in the middle of Tucson, Arizona, bought 1,000 hectares of land and parked these aircrafts. If you want to know how big 1,000 hectares are, you have to put 2,000 football fields next to each other. The weather of this area is extremely important on why they took this place. Very dry and hot, and it has a very hard ground, and that means no moisture so nothing rusts, and it's not soft for the airplane to sink into the ground. They just made the land flat and the airplanes move around, and it very rarely rains here. You could find all types of US military aircrafts here. I mean, look at the B-52s. Some of them are parted out. In the middle right there, you see some F-15. On the back side, you see some C-135s. So how did these aircrafts get here? Do they bring them with trailers? No. All airplanes fly here, and most of them, it's going to be their last flight ever. There's really no plans of airplanes that land here. They can fix an airplane in 2 weeks and have it fly again. They can also dismantle it in 2 weeks and part it out, but they could leave it in a corner and leave it there for 50 years. There are a lot of airplanes here from the Vietnam War, and they still haven't had time to touch it, and it's not important for them. When they plan on leaving the aircraft, they don't just leave it. First, they spray a special compound. That's a protective layer of the aircraft, and it doesn't let anywhere rust. They close every hole of the airplane. They close all the windows with a special tape, and obviously cover the engines up. They take the fuel out, and also all the other fluids like the oil. That's because they don't want anything to stay in the airplane, just in case they want to fix it up again. They put a special white tape over the windows that reflects light, and it doesn't allow the light to go inside. Arizona is a desert and it's extremely hot. If they allow the sunlight to enter this cabin, it will destroy it very quickly. It's also good to know that every airplane is tied down to the ground. And that's because if some heavy winds comes along, they don't push these airplanes around and hit each other with it. But how does this airplane graveyard actually make money? Let's just say they don't have any issues making money. Most of these airplanes you see are still being flown in other countries, and they need the parts. Like Egypt orders a fuel gauge of a C-130, and they have plenty of that. If they have approval from the government, they could send that country the part. They could part out all the airplanes except the F-14, because the only country other than the US that has F-14s is Iran, and they don't want the parts to get to Iran, and that is why it was not recycled like the other planes. So now we realize that this graveyard sells between 4,000 to 7,000 parts a year, and that means they make millions sending different parts to different countries around the world. If you didn't know, the US still have some of these planes in service, and obviously they will order parts from this place as well. Like no other country has B-52s, so obviously the US is the only one that orders it. They do another thing in this place. If they see an airplane that's actually not that bad and it's clean, they will rebuild it and put it back in service. Like for example, the F-16s that come here, it's very rare for them to get parted out, because if they want to buy a new one, it's extremely expensive. It is true that rebuilding is extremely expensive. Like for example, if you want to rebuild an F-16 wing, it will take 20,000 man-hours, and that's just one wing. Airplane parts are extremely fragile, and one small crack on one part that nobody can see can cause something catastrophic. And that is why every metallic piece enters a special liquid, and the liquid identifies hairline cracks if it has it. If any aircraft wants to go back in service, they have to run through some special tests from every direction. If everything is in order, they could give it to the army. But don't think that happens to every airplane. This is a small percentage of these planes. More than 90% of these planes get parted out and go inside boxes to be shipped to different countries. This was the biggest graveyard of aircrafts. You might ask, what about passenger aircrafts? There are different companies that part out passenger aircraft, and the laws to part out military aircraft is much more different, and not everybody has access to it. Any aircraft that's at the end of its life, they contact these companies and they come and take care of business.